Hey, this is Michael Easley. Upcoming on In Context, we have a number of guests that we're bringing in specifically to talk about issues around the election. We know as believers and as men and women who vote, it's a challenge sometimes to know, is it left, is it right? How do we understand these issues? So we brought together some subject matter experts from different areas to help you think critically, to think biblically, and to think carefully about your right to vote. At the end of the day, it is your individual choice, but from my words to your ears, I want you to vote, and I want you to vote intelligently with a good conscience. We want to bring some thought-provoking programs and experts to help you think critically about how you use your vote as a believer in Christ. And today on the broadcast is our friend Cal Beisner, and he and I talk about a number of issues about the stewardship of creation, about global warming, about climate change, and how that might impact the way you think about voting. Welcome to the broadcast. This is Michael Easley inContext, and we've got a friend of the program back on again, Dr. Cal Beisner. If you don't know Cal, I am going to read some of his vita. I can't read it all because that would be the end of our time together. But he is the founder and the national spokesman for the Cornwall Alliance, the Stewardship of Creation, a network of 60-plus Christian theologians, natural scientists, economists, and other scholars educating for a biblical earth stewardship, including economic development for the poor, the proclamation and defense of the good news of salvation by Jesus Christ through faith in him. He's written over a dozen books. He's edited 30 plus and contributed to 35 plus. He's published thousands of articles, and we won't list that obviously in his CV. He's been involved in a lot of policy. He's been involved in a lot of stewardship efforts. And Cal and I became acquainted through a mutual friend, Ralph Weitz, who's on his board at some level. And Ralph is a longtime pastor friend from the D.C. area. And that's where I was introduced to Cal's great work. He has taught at Covenant College, at Knox Theological Seminary. He's been on a pastoral staff in Florida. And he left to become the full-time founder and director of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. As always, information is in our show notes about our guest and their books. His newest book, Climate and Energy, The Case for Realism. We've already interviewed Cal on that text. He and David Legace edited it. It's a fine book you need to pick up. So with all that, let me just welcome you back to the broadcast. Thank you for taking time to join us again, Cal.
Well, thank you for having me on the show, Michael. And that was way too much about me.
Howard Hendricks said it's like perfume, a little goes a long way.
Right.
Well, let's talk about a couple things. One, not on our script today, but one, this whole EV now move to hybrid. What's your take on that? I have a friend in Dallas who just bought a car that's a hybrid car, not an EV. Mm-hmm. But a hybrid car. And I thought, I don't think you and I we've talked about EV at length, but I don't think we've talked about this hybrid move. Is there any net benefit in that?
Yeah, hybrid cars are really pretty good stuff because what they do is they make use of otherwise wasted energy to continually charge their battery while the car is running on gasoline or diesel. When you stop, for example, you are actually wasting a bunch of energy, and a hybrid car is designed to recover that energy from the braking system, put it into a battery, and then while you're running along quietly, smoothly, it uses that electricity to power your drive chain. And that's a great idea. As a matter of fact, because hybrids are much easier to produce and don't require the enormous, extremely heavy batteries loaded with all kinds of cobalt and lithium and things like that are very difficult to mine and a filthy sort of a process, and frankly are controlled primarily by China. The hybrids actually offer a better way to reduce emissions of carbon dioxide, if indeed that's what somebody wants to do. Now, I don't see any good reason at all to reduce emissions of carbon dioxide, CO2 is a wonderful thing. It's absolutely necessary for life on Earth. Plants grow better the more of it they get. And that means everything that depends on plants does better the more CO2 is in the atmosphere. So there's really no need to reduce CO2. But if the aim is to do that, hybrids are a much better way to do that than EVs.
Now, some of these hybrids are a combination. You're still charging them at home to top off that battery, and
You
that
can do
battery is
that.
still requiring some rare earth materials, correct?
Yes, but nowhere near the amount
The
that
full
goes into
EV.
the full EV batteries. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about issues that are on your mind, the improving energy systems. And for our listeners, give us a little background on what that means, and let's dive in.
Well, it's helpful just to start with the recognition that energy is absolutely indispensable to human well-being. And that's because, as we learned back, well, at least I hope we learned back when we were in middle school, energy is the capacity to do work. That's the definition of energy. And you have to do work to make food and clothing and shelter and communications and transportation and everything else that we use. It all requires energy. And so the more of those you want, the more energy you need to be able to consume. Well, that means you need to keep your energy prices low. The more expensive energy is, the less of it you can use. The cheaper it is, the more of it you can use. And so a key issue in all energy policy and energy infrastructure is, what's the cost of transforming energy from the state in which we find it in nature, which is generally pretty low density and not highly refined, highly concentrated, to the manner in which we need to actually use it. And so, for example, the history of our use of energy has been, for thousands of years, little by little, and then very, very quickly, a move from very low density sources of energy, primary sources, to higher and higher density primary sources of energy. Initially, basically, all of our energy was just simply carbohydrates. It was the food that we ate, moved into our bodies, and turned into, through metabolism, bodily energy through our muscles. And that was all we had. And that kind of energy basically could only support a hunting and gathering kind of an economy. That is, you go out, you dig up roots that are edible, you find nuts and berries, you occasionally manage to kill an animal and you eat that, you use fire, some energy to cook that, and so on. Well, hunting and gathering cannot support more than about 1 or 2 people per square mile in the very best of habitats. Little by little, of course, we started learning to use fire. Then we began, little by little, to use wind in the sails of vessels, and then water energy, the flow of water through wheels that would turn mills and so on. And then and all of that was still very low density in its origin, and really difficult to transform into a way that we could use it very well. In in some places as early as BC, but very rarely and only a little bit, did we begin to use coal or similar things, which are much higher density than wind and plants in their energy concentration at the start. And so when we figured out how to use coal to make steam, to turn turbines, to generate electricity, we just shot upward in our ability to energize all the activities that are necessary to make food, clothing, shelter, and everything else. So our historical track has been from low density to high density. Here's a problem. I think unjustified fears of catastrophic global warming driven by adding CO2 to the atmosphere when we burn coal, oil, and natural gas, fossil fuels. Those unjustified fears are leading to people saying, oh, look, we need to stop using the fossil fuels and replace them with wind and solar. Now, the problem with that is twofold. First off, wind and solar are very, very low density sources of energy compared with coal, oil, and natural gas. Coal, oil, natural gas, anywhere from about 600 times to about 1,500 times the density of either wind or solar. Second, wind and solar are highly intermittent. It's not always windy, it's not always sunny. And so that means that either you have to store a great deal of energy in batteries or by pumping water up into a reservoir at a high altitude, and then when you need it, you let that water flow down to a low altitude, turning turbines and generating electricity, and then later you have to pump it back up again. So of course you're wasting a great deal of that energy, right? Either you have to store a bunch of energy, or you have to keep non-intermittent base load generating stations running all the time, but at a very low efficiency in order to back up and replace that wind and solar whenever the wind stops blowing or the sun goes down or the clouds come across it. So what we're being asked to do is to revert historically to lower density and intermittent sources instead of the high density and dependable, on demand, any moment you want them, coal, oil, and natural gas. And of course, the highest density we can get right now is nuclear. Uranium is really good stuff, and that is thousands of times more dense and can run far cleaner than any other energy source. There are wonderful things that we can do with oil and natural gas other than just burn them up to make energy. So I'm very in favor of replacing them as much as possible over time with nuclear.
Well, and there are some projects for smaller nuclear plants that are popping up around the country. Some of these have been in development for 6-10 years, and they're now coming online.
Yeah, I'm not sure that any are actually online, certainly not in a commercially viable way yet, but they are workable, and it's a long regulation approval process. Yeah, it's
not the science.
It's as Ronald Reagan said, the 9 most feared words in the English language are "We're from the government. We're here to help."
Here to help you.
Yeah, but certainly small nuclear reactors, small modular reactors, are definitely a wonderful breakthrough. And the cool thing about them is we will be able to produce them automated in mass, and then just simply move them to wherever they're needed.
Yeah.
And you can add one after another to a given location without having to go through the whole application and permit process over and over again. So eventually those are going to be tremendous for us.
Unrelated but interesting. We were in Iceland not long ago, and we took a private tour of some of the area in Reykjavik. I did not know that place is run on geothermal, the whole thing.
Yeah.
The largest aluminum plants in the world are there, and they're geothermal. It's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it's pretty cool, or rather, it's pretty hot.
Pretty hot.
Geothermal is very hot stuff. The problem is that there are very few.
You are living on a volcano.
Right. There are very few places in the world that can do that.
Oh, that's the problem. Okay. Let's talk about this emphasis of the Green New Deal and the clean environment. We've talked about this before, but I think some of our friends maybe haven't heard those interviews or know of some of these details. Yeah. But a lot of misinformation out there, Cal, and you and your team have been, really fighting this battle in some respects very, very much solo to at least have people think critically about what they're hearing from a popular soundbite TikTok level versus science that really challenges some of the mainstream ideology.
Yeah. Thanks for raising the fact that we have been fighting this battle for a long time, and sometimes even seems like almost solo. We're not really solo. There are some others who are doing it and doing it very well, and I'm very grateful for that. Okay, so what's to be said about the Green New Deal and so on. Well, Green New Deal, of course, initially came out touted by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and it was the cost of implementing it was estimated back at the time by various different economic think tanks, and the costs far outweighed the benefits that would come from it. I used to, have the numbers memorized. I don't anymore. It's been long enough.
It was trillions, if I remember.
Oh yeah, definitely trillions of dollars, well over 10. But I do know some numbers on a more up-to-date matter, and that is the demand that somehow or other the world needs to reach net zero. That is, balancing our emissions of carbon dioxide with our extraction of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The cost of achieving net zero has been estimated, and this is written about by Bjorn Lomborg in a wonderful article in Wall Street Journal, has been estimated at an average of $27 trillion per year from now to the end of this century. And by the end of the century, it will have risen to $67 trillion. Now, in return for that, what would be achieved? Possibly a reduction of global average temperature in the year 2100 of maybe 1 or 2/10 of a degree Celsius, which would be of absolutely zero impact on any ecosystem or on any human well-being. Our economies would not be helped by it whatsoever. Now, that's just absurd. So what we're being asked to do is to commit...
What part of it?
What part of it isn't absurd? No part isn't.
It's striking when you think of our national deficit and debt, and the contribution of American taxpayers as it is. You can't print that kind of money. I mean, it's just science fiction in the truest sense. But one of the things, and you brought this up in your writing and in your speaking, and I would say perhaps it's revealing my own lack of knowledge on the subject, but how all this impacts the poor, Cal. And when you think about the left, and if we want to say, okay, they argue about poverty and inequity and fairness, and they would love universal income and universal health care and some of these ideologies. But that being said, this effort to control climate the way they pretend really puts an incredible burden on the poor.
Yeah. Every single policy prescribed to try to slow global warming is a policy that slows, stops, or reverses the climb out of poverty of developing countries around the world. Not only that, but it hurts the poorer people even in developed countries. The increase in energy prices that has happened in the United States, driven largely by climate policy, has harmed the poor more than anybody else. One way to recognize that is this. The average American spends about 7 or 8% of his income, or household spends about 7 or 8% of its income on energy.
Now that's including, let me interrupt, that's including your home, your cars, everything.
Energy, gas for the car, everything, all the energy you use, right? The average household in the bottom quintile of Americans, the lowest 20% of income earners, spends close to 30% of its income just on energy. Now, figure what happens if you raise the cost of energy by, say, 20%, which is more than it has been raised in the last 4 years. Right? I'm sorry, it's less than it's been raised in the last 4 years.
I was going to say, wait a minute. Yeah.
If you do that, for the average American household, that means you go from 7 or 8% to, say, 10 or 11% of your household income. But for that bottom quintile household,
that's a big chunk.
You go from about 30% to instead, about 36%, 37%. And in other words, you have raised their costs almost as much as the total cost previously to the average American family. That's devastating. That's really just destructive. So this is part of why we at the Cornwall Alliance are so concerned about this. Frankly, these are the kinds of concerns that got me into all of this over 30 years ago in the very first place. Why would I, a theologian, historian, apologist, economist, care about climate change and climate science? Well, because I see that what the policies are doing is harming the world's poor. Mm-hmm. The very last chapter of our book, Climate and Energy, The Case for Realism, that you mentioned at the start of the show, which, by the way, has been an Amazon bestseller ever since it came out in March in
Congratulations.
2 different categories. Yeah. Thank you. The very last chapter is by Vijay Jayaraj. He is an Indian climate scientist as well as an energy expert. He's done a degree in that as well. And he specifically describes how Western-induced climate and energy policies are already harming the poor in the developing world all over.
Wow. Well, in India, India and China, we've talked about this before. Those are our two biggest, contributors on both sides, both consumers and contributors, and yet nothing is really done or said in these economies. Right. What's when you compare the U.S. to India and China, what are we talking percentage of our contribution to this problem?
Comparatively, the U.S. contribution is very small. I'm not going to try to recite numbers because I wouldn't have them accurate, and there's no point in that. But I can tell you this. China's emissions of carbon dioxide are more than all the emissions of all the rest of the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development countries combined. And China is still building 2 new coal-fired power plants, finishing every week. We could completely eliminate all U.S. emissions tomorrow. I mean, we all just die. We close down all the factories, everything else, right? Eliminate all U.S. emissions tomorrow. And just the emissions that China would add in the next year would exceed that. That's now, frankly, I don't have any problem with India and China emitting a lot of CO2 because I think the more CO2 you got in the air, the better it is, right? Its contribution to warming is very tiny. Its contribution to food growth is immense, just enormous. So I think that's a good thing. But as long as the world is going to be uptight about CO2 emissions, it should be a whole lot more uptight at China and India than at America.
Are there other pollution factors that, besides CO2 and the carbon, dance, are there other pollution factors that we're not talking about?
Yeah, sure. Sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, soot, that sort of thing, carbon monoxide, those are all things that come from burning fossil fuels. But we already have very effective systems for scrubbing those out and keeping them from getting into the atmosphere. The only thing in an advanced, high-tech coal-fired power plant, which is about the only sort of coal-fired power plant left operating anywhere in the highly developed world, the only thing that comes out of their so-called smokestacks, which are not smokestacks, the water vapor and carbon dioxide. That's all. They're both good. They're really wonderful things, right? Now, in much poorer countries, we're still getting the dangerous emissions from those power plants because it's a lot more expensive to build the high-tech power plant than the low-tech power plant. But that's not a problem. That is a path through progress. They're getting to adopt the higher tech methods more rapidly than we did. Our skies in Pittsburgh back in the 1930s and 40s were as filthy as anything you've ever seen pictured over Beijing nowadays.
Sure.
We cleaned it up over time. Well, they're going to get to clean theirs up faster than we did Except, of course, that the communist government may not be as responsive to citizens' demands as America's government was, but that's an entirely different problem from a problem of the technology itself.
Now, we've also in the past talked about Cornwall Alliance's concern for clean water and
Yes.
clean environment. And so on the one side, we can argue, and you have demonstrated that carbon is really not as big an issue as we've been sold. The carbon footprints, this exchange dance that the auto
Yeah.
manufacturers have to do. We can put one car out that has 31 miles to the gallon to compensate for the car that gets 10 miles to the gallon.
Yeah.
It's just a game. But when you think of water sources and I mean a train that crashes and pollutes a town, there are things that ostensibly we need to pay attention to.
There are, of course. And what we also need to remember is the importance of looking at things over a long period of time, taking motion pictures, so to speak, instead of snapshots. If I take a snapshot of let's see, Palestine, uh, Ohio, was it?
Yeah,
Where the
yeah.
train ran off the tracks and dumped all that chemical waste. It was a real tragedy, a terrible thing. I take a snapshot of that and I think, okay, this is what's happening all the time everywhere that there are railroad tracks, right? No, no, no. That's not even what happens all the time at Palestine, right? It happened there that time. What we can do instead is to look at the history of the safety of transport by train or by pipeline or by truck, right, of various different chemicals, right? And what we see is that over time, that safety record improves more and more and more as we get wealthier and therefore can afford the more expensive
Technologies.
technologies
Hmm.
to do them safely. So that's a part of why it's so important to look at long-term environmental measures rather than short-term. Back in the 1990s, I was the managing editor for a book called The State of Humanity. The general editor of that was the late Julian L. Simon, one of the world's greatest scholars in the field. We had 58 chapters by 60 authors, including 8 Nobel Prize winners. And the aim of the book was to look at all sorts of different measures of human well-being, of environmental quality, and so on, over the longest time scales for which we could find properly comparable data. And what we showed was that in pretty much everything, improvement was the story. Uh, Human health is better, human lifespan is better, uh, air pollution is down, forest square miles are up, on and on. You name it, it's getting better and better. And that's not just kind of an ideological, okay, I'm committed to the cult of progress. It's just empirical measurement of what's been happening. Now, it won't necessarily continue to happen. What's most likely to turn us around and hurt those things is if we move increasingly away from private ownership of property, including land, real land property, and entrepreneurship, and free trade, and limited government, and the rule of law, toward more collective ownership of property
Hmm.
and government-run businesses and socialist planning of economies and so on, because what we see very, very clearly from history is that the record of socialist economies on environmental protection is horrendous compared with the record of capitalist economies. I've written about that in a book called Is Capitalism Bad for the Environment?, which is available from Cornwall Alliance's online store at cornwallalliance.org/shop.
Which let me interrupt for just a second and say the number of resources at the Cornwall Alliance website, and again I caveat this: we're not shilling, we're trying to provide resources, information, and Cal has so many great resources. If it was a topic that you've been in an argument with your neighbor about, there's probably a booklet, a pamphlet, or a chapter on the Cornwall Alliance site. So it is something. Again, in the show notes we have all the information for you to take a look, and we encourage you to look around all the work that Cal's been doing. But I'm sorry for the interruption, but I wanted to inject that.
I think that was a great spot for an interruption. We can move on to your next topic.
You won't turn away a promotion by somebody else. I understand that.
Right,
it's good stuff. We don't promote stuff that's not great. Help the average. You made a comment earlier about the evangelical group being more skeptical about some of the climate change thing.
Yes.
Expand on that a little bit and talk to the skeptic. Maybe think of 2 or 3 or 4 bullet points that you hit all the time about what they really need to understand about. And there's so many issues. There's, we're going to turn our thermostats up to 78 or 80 in the summer. We're going to turn them down to 60 in the winter. We're going to, drive less. All these things that were and you mentioned socialism. There's a push for a lot of this, and some corporations have done this on their buildings. I've gone into facilities and I've walked out of. It's so uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I don't want to conduct business or purchase something when I'm, miserable in these settings. So there's a lot of factors that impact the individual. And so speak to some of those that you are so well versed in so that they understand this isn't simply about fossil fuels being evil and bad. And there's much more to this discussion than they're often aware.
Yeah, let me see if I can do this for you a bit. When you said speak to the skeptic, you have in mind the skeptic of my position, or the skeptic
I'm thinking about
of
the believer who's skeptical of. They're kind of like, well, that does make sense. I've heard about this carbon thing, and I've heard about global warming, the broad scope, Cal. Where we get into some of the detail. But I think there's a lot of people out there that just put, they kind of go, I don't really know. We should probably get an EV or a hybrid. And their thinking isn't always aligned with information.
Okay. Well, first, let me just make a recommendation that your viewers look up online River Oaks Academy and go to their YouTube channel and go to a series of videos on Christianity and technology, because I just finished 4 Sunday school lessons for them, River Oaks Reformed Presbyterian Church in Germantown, Tennessee, that are part of that much larger series. And the very last one was specifically on climate change, and I think your listeners would find that very helpful. But let me mention a few things out of that, all right? Here's one of the first. Don't be misled by those who would say, look, you're either a complete denier and climate change is just a hoax and nothing is really happening here, or you have to recognize that climate change is not only real, but it's overwhelmingly man-made, and it is really disastrous, and it's even an existential threat. That's totally bogus. No good scientists are on either end of that spectrum. Where the science is really strong is what we describe in our book, Climate and Energy, The Case for Realism. Human-induced climate change is real. It is not catastrophic, probably has more benefits than risks in terms of global temperature. And certainly we get far more benefits from the energy that contributes to it than from any harms that would come from it, and from the added carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that makes plants grow better. All right, so that would be a first part. Recognize you can embrace human-induced climate change and not be a catastrophist. Here's another one. There are various scare tactics that the catastrophists use. One of them, I'm sure your listeners will all have seen somewhere or other, the iconic graph that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and
NOAA.
NASA and various others use. A graph showing the change in global average temperature from, say, 1880 to the present. And it's from an average, a zero baseline, right? Before that, you have blue bars going downward, indicating it was cooler than that line, right? After that, you have red bars going upward, and that's hot, right? Red, fire, danger, right? Blue, cool, nice, right? Okay. This is emotional manipulation. What most people don't recognize is that in that graph, the bottom to the top is a grand total of 2 degrees Celsius, right? I mean, how many of us have been really, really hurt by a change in temperature of 2 degrees Celsius? That's insane. If you take the exact same numbers and graph them on a vertical axis, not of 2 degrees Celsius, but of, say, 20 degrees Celsius, which is fairly common difference between nighttime low and daytime high in many places around the Earth. You graph it that way, instead of going like this, your graph kind of goes like this. Barely can see any increase, right? And you can put it on a broader scale than that, go from 0 degrees Kelvin, right, absolute zero, to the hottest temperature that's ever been measured in Earth's atmosphere, a little over 327 degrees Kelvin. And what you get is a straight line. There's no trend observable. So don't be scared by things like this. We're also told, hey, global warming is causing more frequent and more severe extremes of weather, hurricanes, floods, droughts, heat waves, cold snaps, tornadoes, and so on. That is not true. It's what some models predict, but there is zero observational evidence that that has occurred. And in fact, for hurricanes, there's actually been a slight decline in the number and intensity of hurricanes over the period of man-made global warming. There's an explanation for that, but it's too detailed to go into right now.
Well, let me inject for just a sec. Let me interrupt again right there, because I hear people pejoratively say when it's hot or cold, they go, oh, it's global warming. There's a difference between weather patterns and global warming. And just from a 12th grade education, not getting too deep in the numbers and the math as you are able, this is sort of a duh for a lot of people. Just because it's a warmer summer does not mean it's a global warming.
Right. And the news media about Hurricane Beryl, right?
Right.
They touted the fact this was the earliest Cat 4 or Cat 5 hurricane on record, right? Well, problem is that prior to about 1965 or a little after that, we didn't have the means of observing most hurricanes that developed out in the middle of the ocean and never came toward land. And so we have no idea whether there were Cat 4 or Cat 5 hurricanes prior to this, that early in the year. But in addition, those who report this as proof of dangerous warming are ignoring the point you just made. Weather is not climate. Weather is what happens in a fairly small area over a fairly short period of time, maybe a couple of weeks or so. Climate is the average of weather in a very large region, or the globe as a whole, over a minimum of 30 years. So a hurricane is weather, it's not climate. And it is not evidence of anything happening in climate. And so that's another of the scare tactics that people will use. Here's the last one I'll mention right now.
Okay.
You mentioned the cold and the heat, right? Well, greenhouse gas-induced global warming happens primarily toward the poles, primarily in the winter, primarily at night. Now, there are reasons for that. Again, too complex to explain right now. But that's the case. It doesn't happen toward the equator in the summer in the daytime. The result is a reduction in the difference in temperature between the equator and the poles.
Okay.
Now, what hurricanes do in our climate system is they move heat from the equator to the poles. The less the temperature gradient between the two, the less work there is for hurricanes to do. That's why you should expect fewer of them. But here's the really cool thing about this, or I could call it the warm thing, right? Because we raised low temperatures more than we raise high temperatures, and because cold snaps on average kill 10 to 20 times as many people per day as heat waves, global warming should result in a net reduction of temperature-related deaths. Now, we hear in the media all the time about people dying because of heat waves. Well, yes, they do. But 10 to 20 times as many per day would die of cold snaps of similar intensity. And so this is really good news. This is how we can protect ourselves from being misled by the media.
Well, the last thing I want to talk about, and it's delicate and it's complex because we have such a divided country right now, is, it sounds as simple as, red and blue voting. It sounds Democrat versus Republican. This is such a complex issue. It's so many levels. If you have a moral relativism type of hierarchy, where's climate concern in a Christian's mind when he or she goes to vote?
Wow. It has to be one among many different items on our minds. Because in my understanding, climate change, the fears of existential threat climate change have become the number one rationale for saying we need to abandon capitalism, private property rights, entrepreneurship, limited government, free trade, the rule of law, and embrace socialism instead. And we need to abandon independent nations and move toward global government. And because I believe that those things are extremely dangerous, far more dangerous than anything related to climate, right? Therefore, I think we should recognize that those who are promoting strong policies to try to control global average temperature, right, to respond to climate change, are promoting policies that are themselves very, very dangerous. So it should be one among a wide variety of different topics to which we respond. And we all need to remember that in every election, we're never faced with, you don't have Jesus Christ and Satan on the ballot, right? Okay, we're never facing.
Some would argue.
We're never facing the choice between absolute good and absolute evil. Every human being is a fallen sinner. Some are worse sinners than others. Some are brighter, more intelligent than others, and so on. But that's the case. We never face the absolute good versus the absolute evil. And people get upset about the notion of, well, I'm not going to vote for the lesser of two evils. That's still voting for evil. But mathematically, the lesser of two evils means exactly the same thing as the greater of two goods. And so we have to get rid of this notion that somehow or other, I'm not going to vote for the lesser of two evils. We're always voting for the lesser of two evils or the greater of two goods, which are the same thing. We also have to remember that we're never voting, particularly in the presidential elections, which seem to be the ones that most people pay most attention to. They may not really be the most important. But in those, we're not just voting for one man or one woman. We're voting for a president and a vice president and a presidential platform, a candidate's
It's a policy
platform,
structure. It's
and
a
a
policy
party
structure.
platform,
Yeah.
and 3,000 some political appointees that president will make, plus hundreds of federal judicial appointments that president will make, possibly including 1, 2, 3 Supreme Court appointments. In other words, the president is one part of a larger package. And it could be that the president we vote for is the price we're willing to pay to get that package instead of the package that would come with this other president we might vote for. In other words, we're not so much voting for the one person. We're voting for a package, and we're comparing two packages. So as Christians, we really have a tough job because we have to be guided by the biblical command to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God at the same time that we're living in a fallen world where none of our choices is perfect.
It's a good word. Dr. Cal Beisner, he is the president of the Cornwall Alliance for the Creation of Stewardship. And as always, information in our show notes. And Cal, it's always a privilege to have you on the podcast. Thank you for always coming on when we ask you.
Well, thank you. It's always a privilege to be with you.